Morning, everyone. I have to say, I much prefer my usual post of serving tea and coffee at the back of the church and in the canteen than being up front and central here. But this is where I find myself this morning. Have you ever done that thing where you're doing something on your computer or your phone, it's like an email, and then another email or you get a notification that pops in, and it looks a lot more interesting than what you're currently doing, so you then click on that little notification on that email that then leads to another click and maybe another one, and then before you know it, you've wasted half an hour. Or, in my case, that leads to a series of events. That means that you were standing on stage this Sunday morning. So be warned, that's what you get for not staying on task for something. So, May last year, 2018, was my fatal click, shall we say. It was an article that came in of recommended summer reading. I'm sure you've all had similar articles in your inbox or magazines that you read. And so that click led to the purchase of a book. This book, which I think will come up on your screens. Garden City. So it's talking about Garden of Eden to Jerusalem. And it's called Work, Rest and the Art of Being Human by John Mark Comer. 50% of the book is about work, and the other 50% of the book is about rest. I'd really recommend this book. If anything I say this morning makes you want to read further, it's dead easy reading, but it's packed full of really good stuff. So the rest half of the book was what really spoke to me and challenged me and set us off, well, myself and Adrian, on a small journey. Looking back, as so often we do, it's only in retrospect that we see the Lord's hand on our lives. And I suppose little did I know that in 2018, when I read this book and then several more about Sabbath, that it was then going to be probably one of the busiest periods of my life. Apart from when I had 3 children under 5 at home, of course, not much competes with that. So this book led to a few more books being bought, and so it wasn't actually a very cheap click either. So this morning I want to talk about rest and the Sabbath, and why I think we desperately need to rediscover this wonderful gift of Sabbath rest that God has given us. We're a restless society. I think we're feeling the results of a lack of rest in all areas of our lives and communities. We can work and shop 24/7, and many of us do. Juggling responsibilities at work and at home, trying to take care of our families, and if we're lucky, ourselves. We live in a culture that says action and accomplishment are better than rest, that doing anything is better than doing nothing. Our relationships need time and energy, and they suffer when we're excessively busy, and then guilt sets in. Our modern, constantly connected lives can leave us feeling drained, frantic, exhausted, playing catch-up with demands on our time like never before. We wear our busyness sometimes almost as a badge of honour and importance. We speak to somebody, how are you? Oh, I'm so busy. I've got to do this, da-da-da-da-da. Oh, how are you? Oh, I'm so busy, blah, 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 blah. This doesn't sound like or feel like a successful, flourishing life. So, if you're thinking this morning, that sounds just a little bit like my life, then hopefully this will be good news for you this morning. So, let's start at the beginning. The very beginning, Genesis. And on the 7th day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done. There's quite a lot of repetition in that sentence, The use of repetition in the Bible usually emphasizes the importance of a person, an event, or a theme. They didn't have bold or italics or highlighters in those days, so their way of making something seem important was repetition. So God blessed the seventh day. We read a few days earlier that God created man and woman in his own image, and God blessed them. And then the second thing God blesses is the seventh day. But God just doesn't stop at blessing the seventh day. God goes one step further and makes it holy. So the first thing we read that God makes holy isn't a mountain, isn't a tree, isn't a river. It's a day, it's time. It's something that we can't feel, touch, or see. It's a space in time. The Hebrew word for holy is kodesh. It means set apart, separateness, sacredness. God was setting apart this day from the other 6 days by making it holy. And as it says, why did he make it holy? Because on it, God rested from all his work. God rested. God, who doesn't need to sleep, God, who doesn't get tired or weary, or ever take a holiday, rested. As we've tried to practice the Sabbath day, I've often wondered what God resting actually looks like. The Hebrew word to rest or to cease is Shabbat, which is where we get the word Sabbath and sabbatical from. So this first mention of Sabbath is rooted in the creation story. If we go forward into Exodus, we read about the Israelites, what life was like in Egypt under the tyranny of Pharaoh. A life of slavery and exhausting, relentless work. The Israelites' main purpose as slaves in Egypt was to make bricks, lots of bricks. They were in a system where Pharaoh endlessly demanded more and more production for building huge store cities for his material wealth, which in those days was in the form of grain. We read in Exodus 1:13. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. When Moses and Aaron first approached Pharaoh and asked the people maybe let go in order to hold a feast to the God of Israel, Pharaoh's response, no way, they're going to work even harder. And in verse 5, chapter 5 of Exodus, you shall no longer give the people straw to make bricks as before. Let them go and gather straw for themselves, but you shall require of them the same quantity of bricks as they have made previously. Do not diminish it, for they are lazy. More production with less resources. Maybe that sounds a bit like your work situation. More and more demands being put on you with less resources available. It's clear that in this system there was no Sabbath rest. There was no work stoppage because frantic productivity drove the entire system. So eventually, Moses and Aaron lead the people out of this life of slavery. They are now a free people, and they need to learn a new way of living. They've been living in Egypt for 430 years. They need to now learn to live as a liberated people with the God of Israel as their king. So a few chapters later, we have Moses going up to Mount Sinai, who speaks with God and who gives the people their new rules for living, the 10 Commandments, which start, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And we go on for the other 10 commandments. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God. And then we have commandment 4, which is the longest commandment and the only one that starts with the word remember. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall do no work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant, or your maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The commandment references creation. However, along with all the other commandments, it's rooted in the Israelites' liberation and their freedom from Egypt. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And notice how it's for everyone. Sons, daughters, manservant, maidservant, even the animals get a look in. In contrast with the grueling daily work that they faced as slaves in Egypt, the Israelites were commanded to remember to take a full day of rest. They're invited to an awareness that life doesn't consist only in their production and their consumption. God isn't Pharaoh. God is not a workaholic. This God rests, and he expects his people to rest too. And that word, remember. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Remember because you're likely to forget. Remember because this is important. Remember because you are more than what you produce. And remember that you were slaves, but you're not anymore. Interesting that the command to rest is set amongst rules about killing, stealing, lying, and idolatry. These are really important precepts when you're creating a new society and telling people how they need to live. It's interesting to remember the Sabbath is deemed as important. Exodus 34 says, "For 6 days you are to work, but on the seventh day you are to rest. Even during ploughing time and harvest, you are to rest." So even when we have a busy season in life, you still need to rest. By the time we get to the New Testament, this day of rest had, under the Pharisees' law, morphed into something of a burden. Jesus and his disciples observed the Sabbath. Jesus wasn't down on the Sabbath. Jesus would be found in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And sure, as we know, he gets into trouble for healing on the Sabbath. And in fact, Jesus seems to pick the Sabbath to do most of his healing. I wonder if he's trying to tell us something. In Mark, we read of the disciples being chastised by the Pharisees for picking the corn as they're walking through the cornfields. They've probably been with Jesus a long time, feeling a bit hungry, picking the ears of corn off. Time for a snack. Jesus responds to the Pharisees' attack on the disciples snacking with a story about King David. And we read and follows it with this comment. Mark 2. Then he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." I've often wondered whether Jesus said this in an exasperated way, in disbelief about something that was meant to be a gift to humanity, was sadly now a burden. The irony of the Pharisees criticizing the one who had given the Sabbath. And it's not that eating or healing on the Sabbath were wrong, but the Pharisees were like the law police. They loved the law. They would take the laws in the Torah and then add extra laws around those in order to protect it, a bit like having a buffer zone around something. And they broke down work into 39 categories. But in addition, they regulated the Sabbath even further with rules about how far you could walk, what you could carry, how much you could carry, what you could cook, on and on and on. By the time of Jesus, we had the written law of the Torah, which was 613 commandments, and then there was this extra oral law called the Mishnah, which was another 1,500 rules. That's 1,500 rules. And it was these extra man-made laws that the disciples were breaking when they were having a snack on the corn. So Jesus' comment that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, is Jesus reminding the Pharisees of the original intent of the Sabbath and basically saying, I'm in charge of the Sabbath. But I don't know about you. We know the Pharisees get a bad rap, and I do feel some sympathy towards them because we're never told what to rest actually looks like or how to define work. And as the first laws came in, I'm sure it was to help and guide the people. I mean, you can imagine the disputes that would come up. I saw my neighbour carrying a plough. I saw him carrying his bricks. That donkey's working. It probably got quite petty because when we're in community, we do need rules. But I feel the original intention was to help define work and rest, but they got lost along the way and lost God's original heart and intention in giving us this gift of the Sabbath. So, what does all this mean for us today? Does the Sabbath still have relevance to us? Can remembering the Sabbath offer us relief and refuge from the busyness of our daily lives? Yes, I think it does. The Sabbath is so much more than a list of do's and don'ts that the Pharisees got hung up on. It's not just a day off work so we can cover the other 6 days and have lots of energy to give to our work. The Sabbath is a day of healing, a day of restoration, a day of celebration, when, like the Israelites coming out of Egypt, we remember that we are worth more than what we can produce. Sabbath is an act of resistance to Pharaoh's system. Pharaoh's system of endless production, more and more bricks, more and more with less resources. That system is still very much alive and kicking today. But we now choose to live in a different system because we have a different king. I love this quote from Walter Brueggemann. Sabbath is an antidote to anxiety. Sabbath is an arena in which to recognize that we live by gift and not by possession. Sabbath is a way to say, enough. It's not that work is bad. Work isn't. Work is as important as rest because work is God-given too. It absolutely is. And if you want to read this book, it'll tell you a lot of reasons why. But for one day a week, we can cease from all work and remember who we are and whose we are. Sabbath gives us permission to rest without guilt. A day when we can rest utterly in the grace of God. A day set aside for worship. Sabbath time can become our refuge. So, as I said, I originally started this journey May last year, and so that set us on a series of events of trying to work out what that would look like. So, Adrian and I have been trying to practice Sabbath over the last 15 months, and we're still working it out. The big thing, it's intentional, and it requires some planning. It won't just happen. So we have our Saturday night to our Sunday tea time, and we leave Sunday evening as a time to get our heads back into work mode and ready for Monday. So housework, odd jobs, all get done on a Saturday. Saturday afternoon, washing machine, switched off till Monday morning. And I'm afraid poor Adrian doesn't get roast dinners on a Sunday anymore. Oh. So I try and prep something on a Saturday, or we have something simple on a Sunday, or do as much prep as I can on a Saturday so we don't have a big pile of washing up to get through and spend hours in the kitchen. I used to save my ironing for a Sunday afternoon. That all gets done on a Saturday now. And when I walk the dog, it's a longer walk at a slower pace. I try to be more mindful of God's creation. I try to be intentional about noticing things and appreciate things. Feeling gratitude rather than walking at a very fast pace and sending a text or replying to an email. And it means, as I said earlier, about not feeling guilty about resting, not feeling guilty about having a nap in the afternoon. No shopping, physically or on the internet. Choosing not to be a consumer for one day, which does take a bit more organisation, and occasionally we do pop to the shops. It's not looking at social media. It's trying really hard not to read my emails. And it's no to-do list. Yay, says Adrian, who normally gets a to-do list on a Saturday. It takes effort, and it does make Saturday a bit more busy. But Sunday's coming. It's Danish pastries for breakfast. It's church, community, worship. It's family. It's phone calls to the kids at uni. It's reading. It's beach walks and cliff paths. We live in a beautiful island that reflects God's majesty and glory in a wonderful way. It's pottering in the garden. It's not the heavy stuff. It's the enjoyable stuff. It's curling up in front of the fire in the winter with a glass of wine and a good book. It's doing a jigsaw puzzle, playing Scrabble, friends around for dinner on Saturday night, ignoring any jobs around the house that need doing. They can wait. And it's slowing time, taking time to be thankful and expressing gratitude. And I know that there is so much more treasure in this day for us to find, not just individually, but corporately when we start to practice that. And it does kind of feel unnatural. As somebody who loves having a to-do list, we can feel our value and our worth and that we've accomplished much just when we can tick off those to-do things. Just as I said earlier, we value doing something, anything, rather than nothing. And Adrian and I will often challenge each other. Is that work? Is that rest? And it's easy to become legalistic. And it will look different for each and every one of us. Some of us do shift work. So it may mean that we need to celebrate Sabbath on a different day of the week, or maybe just an afternoon. And if you're single, why not gather some friends together to eat and feast and make that a special time? If you've got a young family, it's going to be a challenge. Maybe you can take it in turns to give each other some time and some space. We're fortunate we've got older kids, so we have that little bit more time now. But it's about time for meaningful connections. When we're so busy, we don't have time for others. We can barely think about ourselves. So time for being a good neighbour, being a friend. Sabbath gives us this time. It's like learning to play a sport or a musical instrument. It doesn't just happen by reading about it or hearing about it. Sabbath requires practice as well as intention. It's about worship. It's about time to be creative. Whatever that looks like for you, whether you're an artist, whether you write or read poetry, whether you play a musical instrument. It's creating space to allow God to speak into our lives so we can hear that still small voice. As Henri Nouwen put it, the noise of our lives can make us deaf. The noise of our lives can make us deaf. And we don't stop because everything is done and finished. We stop because it's time to stop. Part of the Sabbath is recognizing that our work is never completely done. If we refuse to rest until we're completely finished, we won't rest until we die. When we practice a day of Sabbath rest, we can breathe deeply, knowing and reminding ourselves afresh that it's God that's in control and not us. We can regain balance in the rhythm of work and rest. So, this morning, my plea to each of us is to make a stand against the all-consuming busyness of our lives. Remember the Sabbath day. Experience the Sabbath day. It's holy, and it's a gift to us. Right from the beginning of time, it's built into our DNA. It's a practice that's been neglected, and I believe to the detriment of our lives and the communities in which we live. So, it's time to claim it back again. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for this gift of Sabbath. Lord, help each one of us to put into practice and experience the gift that it is to us. We thank you, Jesus, that you are Lord of the Sabbath, and we can come to you any day of the week for rest. But we thank you also that you have made a day holy and commanded us to take this rest. May we be an obedient people. Amen.